Hello, and welcome to Your Art Sucks, a podcast that aims to destroy mediocrity in all forms of art. And this is episode 5, Publicity, Stunted, Sinead O'Connor and the Sex Pistols. In this episode, we will look at how the necessary evil of self-promotion, usually through acts of publicity stunts, have played out for two artists. Specifically, we will see the impact of these stunts as it pertains to the careers of Sinead and the Sex Pistols. Now, there may be those of you listening who already have a pretty good idea about how one stunt turned out, or possibly both. Or maybe you have no idea what happened to either one of these artists. Wherever you find yourself, be ready to see how publicity can be a boon or a bust to your career. So let's get started. Now, when I was doing research for this episode, I was taken to numerous articles that detailed, examples of how artists, mostly musicians for some reason, found themselves deep in shit from all their ill-conceived attempts at self-promotion. But before we get to Sinead and the Pistols, I thought it would be fun to kind of highlight some of these. Let's take a look at one that's probably on the tip of most people's tongues who are listening right now, and that's the infamous case of Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson. I'm sure most of us remember the 2004 Super Bowl halftime show where Justin, and I'm using air quotes here, accidentally removed Janet's costume. Now, maybe a little bit more of her costume came off than what everybody was expecting, hence the name of Nipplegate for this publicity stunt. This stunt caused a national uproar. Court documents that I've seen, they show that the Federal Communications Commission, that's the FCC in the U.S., they received 540,000 complaints regarding this incident. The FCC chairman, Michael Powell, he stated that this stunt was a classless, crass, and deplorable act. It's kind of ridiculous. It is what it is, just part of the human anatomy. Anyway, it gets worse. MTV, who was in charge of the halftime show, was front and center in the scandal. Their parent companies, CBS and Viacom, basically lost all rights to future halftime shows. That was straight out of the gate. The NFL said, we're not dealing with them anymore. They're done. So Viacom, they decided that they were going to retaliate. And who'd they retaliate on? Well, they retaliated on Janet. For some reason, Justin wasn't attacked. So Viacom intentionally made it clear that her music and videos were going to be banned from all media platforms that they owned, including radio. Now, to further this injustice, Janet was removed from being a presenter at the Grammys, but somehow Justin was allowed to attend, and he won 2 awards. The funny thing is he was also a spokesperson for McDonald's at the time. Family-friendly McDonald's. Well, they didn't get rid of him. They kept him on board. I mean, how fucked up is that? Janet basically becomes the target of everybody's anger. But Justin, the one who actually tore off the costume, he won Grammys and got to continue getting paid by McDonald's. Anyway, many things came out of this Super Bowl fiasco. Most of them were unnecessarily reactionary in nature. First, Viacom was made to pay $550,000 to the FCC for this incident. It was the largest fine ever issued to that date. The FCC goes on to impose strict conditions on live performances moving forward. Basically, what they want to do is enforce a video delay so that the American public maintains some guard against perceived corruptions of, possibly 2 nipples or I don't know. But, they take on a strict standard that if you're going to have a live broadcast, there has to be a video delay so that anything like this can be filtered out. So yeah, it's okay to show TV dramas where people are murdered in all sorts of gruesome ways. But 1 nipple and American morality squads just jump up to DEFCON 5. I mean, double standard much? Now for Janet, even with the Viacom ban and, the massive amounts of backlash she received, she still released her album Demita Joe a couple weeks after the incident. And guess what? It manages to reach number 2 on the charts and go multiple times platinum. So all things being said, she still kind of had the last laugh. Now there's an interesting side note to this whole Super Bowl performance in 2004. There was a programmer, his name was Jawad Karim, And he couldn't find this show anywhere. He wanted to see Janet Jackson have this whole, malfunction. And so he decided with a bunch of his friends that they were going to create a venue where people can easily upload and share videos. Now, what was that platform called? Well, you may now know it as YouTube. So a big thanks to Janet for allowing her nipple to be the impetus of a billion-dollar media empire. Up yours, Viacom. Now, here's another stunt. This one's more recent. In 2014, U2, the band, I'm sure everybody's aware who they are, they thought it was a great idea to basically force their new album, Songs of Innocence, to 500 million iTunes users in the form of an automatic download. Needless to say, there was an immediate backlash. No one, not even their real fans, liked the idea of being force-fed their music. Now, personally, I wasn't that pissed about the idea. I just hated the fact that I had one hell of a time getting their music off my iPod and out of iTunes completely. I mean, it was a shit show. Thing kept auto-downloading. I mean, I'm no genius at this stuff, but it was a pain in the ass. The last example, before we get on to the main content of the show, is kind of the answer to what happens when you cross a subpar band and a really terrible idea. Basically, you get a group called Imperial Stars. I know I never heard of them either. I had to look them up. And they had this idea where they were going to basically borrow something that U2 had kind of done. They wanted to stop traffic like U2 did when they performed on the rooftop. I think it was for their Joshua Tree tour, not quite sure. But they thought, instead of a building, why don't we rent a transport trailer and block a major highway in LA, and we can perform on top of it while thousands of people are just stopped in traffic. Now, anyone with half a brain would have known that this is A, highly illegal, and B, it's seriously angering to the people stuck in a jam who were further incensed by having to endure this really shitty band. Now, thankfully, the police were quick to respond. They showed up, they arrested a bunch of people. Now, the guy driving the transport, he kind of caught on to what was going on. He took off and took the keys with him, so the band was kind of screwed. After the band was arrested, they had to perform again. Only this time, it was community service. But let's get to Sinead O'Connor and how this stunt she performed set golden rule number 1 for all publicity to follow. We're going to talk about what that rule is in a second, but let's set the stage. It was October 3rd, 1992. Now, Sinead was on Saturday Night Live and she was getting ready to perform. And for those of you who don't know, yes, Saturday Night Live is actually live. Live performances went on, things happened. And that's where Saturday Night Live back in the day was pretty interesting. You got to see things in a very raw way. I remember watching all the time, especially when John Belushi or Eddie Murphy was on there, and these guys would try to do a skit and they just bust out laughing. Some of the best moments of Saturday Night Live. Anyway, back to this. She began an a cappella version of a Bob Marley cover of a song called War. So now to this point, Sinead had been a rising star, okay? Her self-produced album, The Lion and the Cobra, which was released in 1987, it was an immediate success. It reached gold status, and for really good reason. Her music was defiant, emotionally charged, and authentic. Here we had a powerful voice that effortlessly flowed from screaming to swooning, all from one young woman who appeared to take no shit from anyone. Her look was edgy for the time, with her shaved head and her piercing eyes. It was bold and unconventional, and most importantly, it was free from commercialization. It rang true with a 20 to 30-year-old demographic who bought records. Her talent had earned her a Grammy nomination for Best Female Rock Performance, and basically she was a newcomer to the scene. And now, by the release of her second album in 1990, titled I Do Not Want What I Have Not Got, Sinead was on the radar of all college radio throughout North America. But it was all a precursor to the smash hit Nothing Compares to You, which was written by Prince. This song rocketed to number 1 in several countries. It earned her another couple Grammy nominations with an eventual win for Best Alternative Music Performance. Sinead, in her trademark defiance, chose to boycott the event. She felt the Grammys were all that was wrong with music at the time. They were glamorizing people and, they were turning it into a spectacle. And she wasn't going to have any of that. Now, in the realm of alternative music, defiance was nothing new. The fact that she was a woman at the time, it did cause a bit of a stir. You have to understand, the industry in the 90s was still misogynistic at best. Women weren't on par with their male counterparts. Something that I'm sure still pervades the industry to this day, but maybe to not the same effect. Now, it became clear to many in the industry that Sinead was not to be fucked with, and she was fine with that. But resentment was becoming a factor in the industry against her. While some artists wanted to work with her, many kind of steered clear. But she was undaunted by all of this. She continued to release albums like Am I Not Your Girl? Now, this album had some mixed success and reviews, but it still continued to rack up some Grammy nods for her. But the controversy that she kind of thrived in, it got pushed a little further when Sinead decided during her U.S. tour that she wasn't going to play venues where the U.S. national anthem was played prior to her show. She said, if you play the anthem, I'm not coming out to play. Now, that stirred up a lot of anger in the general public. They didn't understand what she was getting at, and her message was kind of mixed as to why. This penchant for controversy, it started to become more public. Even Frank Sinatra chimed in on this, and he threatened to, and I quote, kick her ass. Yeah, it was getting nasty. But her fans, her loyal fans, were still with her through all of this, and her music was still in heavy rotation on the radio. So while her controversy was losing her people and pissing off a lot of people, she still maintained a great fan base. Now we come back to the night of October 22nd. Sinead, on SNL, is coming to the end of her song performance, which, you have to remember, earlier in the day when she did her rehearsal, she held up a picture of a refugee child. Everybody looked and said, okay, this is going to be interesting. But when the live performance was going and with cameras rolling, she decided to hold up a picture of Pope John Paul II. And with great passion, she tore the shit out of that thing and she said, fight the real enemy. To those in attendance and those late night viewers on the East Coast, this was an absolutely shocking display. Lorne Michaels, the show's producer, he said he felt the air just immediately get sucked out of the room. The whole place went silent. No one applauded. Nobody booed. Everybody was stunned. And the funny part is, after the performance, Lorne didn't turn on the applause sign, so everybody was kind of shocked and confused as to what they're supposed to be doing. Now here's where something weird happens. The FCC didn't fine NBC for the stunt. Unlike a nipple, religion seems to be well within their standards of controversy. But NBC did get 4,400 complaints over the next couple days. The West Coast feed of SNL that night didn't show the performance. So the impact in a way was minimized. Although limited, the news of the performance, which was channeled through traditional media as there was no social media at the time, it was heavily skewed against her. The following week, SNL had Joe Pesci hold up the same picture of the Pope that had been taped back together, and he stated that if he was there, he would have given her such a smack. Here's the second time, men have gone on record as wanting to assault her. I mean, where was the backlash about that? There wasn't any. Joe Pesci was applauded by the people that were in the audience. And that's what pissed me off. I always considered Saturday Night Live to be kind of an edgy show. They always brought on bands that were controversial. And to have their audience applaud the fucking idiot Joe Pesci for a controversial act, it just pissed me off. I stopped watching Saturday Night Live after that for quite a long time. Now, in all of this anger, the real meaning of what Sinead was trying to bring attention to was lost. The media ran with the act and not the point of it. Her rebellious stunt fell on deaf ears, and for one simple reason. Her execution was absolutely poor. The message was buried in the visual nature of the act. There was literally no tie-in to the cause, and her message was one that didn't relate to the point of it. To everyone watching, it just looked like misdirected aggression. As I said, in 1992, there was no social media that she could have utilized to draw attention to the horror that had continued to occur to the children in churches across the world. You see, the media hadn't picked up on the thousands of hidden abuse cases that would, only a decade later, start seeing the light of day. Sinead was absolutely ahead of the police and the press on this. She was trying to pull back the protective curtain on child abuse that impacted her own life. Now, unfortunately, traditional media had already decided who they were going to attack. She was the devil. I mean, who gives a fuck while she was doing it? It was done, and no one wanted to ask her why. Now, there were a few, magazines that did actually reach out to her, but the message was still distorted when they reported on it. It's because the general public wasn't ready to hear what was really going on. Now, was she right in what she did? Abso-fucking-lutely. But she broke the cardinal rule 1. Don't let the act distract from the message. The cause has to trump the content. Now, you may be thinking, well, this wasn't an act of self-promotion. She wasn't trying to boost sales for her music or sell t-shirts. She was trying to help abused children who were hidden away and powerless in their position. And I would say, yeah, you're 100% correct. The problem is, the public didn't see it as a cry for help. They saw it as another musician trying to shock the public and gain media attention for themselves. Now, obviously, Sinead's career after this stunt was in itself stunted. And as the year continued, Sinead got so much hatred, she kind of withdrew from music scene, and eventually she withdrew from the public eye altogether. Now time did come around to prove Sinead correct, and some now herald her as kind of an angel for bringing this to public attention. And that stunt, by some in the industry, is considered a defining moment. It's just too bad the damage at this point had been done. So let's turn our attention to another musical act that decided to also attack the establishment. But this time, instead of going after the Pope, these guys decided to go after a queen. And as we're about to hear, they had a much different outcome. It was summer 1977 in the UK, and the public was preparing to celebrate the Queen's Silver Jubilee. Now, from what I can ascertain, jubilees are quite a spectacle. It's where the monarchy is front and center, and the public enjoys days of events and parties to commemorate the reign. It was a time-honored tradition, and it was as close to a patriotic act as you can get. But things weren't exactly as they seemed. You see, large sections of the population were suffering from the impacts of multiple government strikes, one of which was the garbage service. And because of this strike, piles and piles of trash were lining the streets for months on end. Mix this in with high unemployment and teenagers who had no hope of a future, it was a pretty bleak time. But within the stench and dread were the seeds of a band who had yet to play a gig or even write their first song. In 1975, in a shop called Sex, basically a place where Vivienne Westwood, who wasn't the famous fashion designer at this time, she was selling her bondage gear and other assorted paraphernalia with her main squeeze, Malcolm McLaren. Now, Malcolm was a bit of a manager of all trades. He liked to be the driving force behind creative scenes, and at points in his life, he had managed bands like the New York Dolls. He did a short stint in New York, got himself ingratiated with the band, did a bit of a stint there with them, but he saw what was going on in New York, and he wanted to replicate that back in the UK. What he did when he got back is he decided to string together a group of misfits who've, frequented the sex shop, and a few of the guys were already instrumentally inclined. They had been in bands before. They were somewhat proficient. But the problem is for Malcolm's vision, these guys were kind of a little too clean. I mean, not physically clean, but just they didn't have an edge. So what he did is he sought out somebody he felt could front the band, somebody who could give these guys this rawness, this unbridled anger. See, he had saw somebody called Richard Hell in New York. Now, Richard Hell's a legend. If you don't know who he is, look him up. He was punk before there was punk. And really, when Malcolm saw him, he was so impressed by this guy's style. This guy was wearing like ill-fitted clothes that were ripped and strung together with safety pins. And it's funny, too, because Malcolm McLaren took that style and brought it back to his own band. He was like, these guys have got to be raw and edgy. They've got to look like they came out of a gutter. Now, Richard Hell doesn't get enough credit for this. He doesn't get enough credit for his vision, even in the general sense of music as a whole. Hopefully that'll change. Hopefully one day people will start to recognize who he is and give him the credit he deserves. But lucky for us, Malcolm's vision, it came to fruition when he roped in a young John Lydon to be the band singer. And you're like, well, who's John Lydon? Well, Johnny became better known as Johnny Rotten. Malcolm McLaren said it was because of his hygiene. I don't know. People have said he had a pretty piss-poor personality, so you take your choice. Now, Johnny, he mocked everything, and he had this ruthless energy, and he had this piercing stare, kind of like Sinead. He could tear you apart without even saying a word. With almost all the pieces in place now, Johnny as the front man, Paul Cook on drums, and Steve Jones on guitar. Well, there was Glenn Matlock too. Now Glenn's interesting because Glenn, if you actually do see pictures of the band, Glenn is usually the cleanest looking with the nicest clothes. He kind of didn't fit in. The problem was Glenn could play his instrument, and he actually wrote some songs for the band, so had a bit of talent there. But to Malcolm and to the band themselves, he wasn't edgy enough. He was too worried about fixing his hair and showering every day to be part of this band. So he was eventually replaced down the line by a guy who came to be known as Sid Vicious. Now, if you look at Sid and you look at Richard Hell, these guys are like duplicates of each other, not like physically, but just in the sense of who they were. Sid was like Richard Hell. He just had a more nihilistic twist to him. So now the band's name. So obviously the shop that they all met in was called Sex. And Malcolm had kind of wanted to work that shop because he was a shameless self-promoter. He wanted to work in that idea of the shop's name along with this kind of idea of a better-looking young assassin, basically a Sex Pistol. And that's how he came up with the band's name. So this fabricated band, with a relatively untested concept, was just waiting for an opportunity to explode on the scene. That opportunity came on pretty quickly, and it actually came in two stunts of defiance. The first stunt that I'll talk to about in a second, it may have been planned, but I don't think so. When you watch it, it just seemed to evolve naturally, but I think Malcolm knew that something negative was going to come out of it. So now, the band itself was growing in popularity. They weren't a household name, but they were traveling around the UK. They were gathering this following of disenfranchised, unemployed, and angry kids who they'd never seen anything like punk because, well, there wasn't anything like punk. So the Pistols were playing all these small clubs, and oddly enough, they had bands like The Clash open for them. That undercurrent was there. The Pistols were just driving this anachronistic kind of mindset, and the youth were picking up on it. So now, with this growing groundswell, the Pistols were eventually signed to record label EMI. And when another EMI band, the legendary rockers known as Queen, when they couldn't make a television appearance on a well-known talk show called Today, the Pistols were slotted in their place. Now, no one knew what was about to happen. I kind of think some people knew. But it was going to usher in a new age for music. And while this isn't the stunt that we were going to focus on in the episode, it certainly helped launch them into infamy. You see, the Pistols weren't about tradition or manners or, even a clean appearance. Civility was, foreign to them. They loathed the establishment, and part of that establishment was the TV host. His name was Bill Grundy. He was like this legend on UK TV. To say that he was full of himself was a bit of an understatement. So when he decided to not really pay the Pistols any of attention, but paid more attention to the women that they brought with them, and that's when the Pistols tore into this guy. They dropped a couple F-bombs, which seems kind of mild-mannered today, but you have to understand, back in the 70s, this was unheard of. This was just outrageous, and it's so mild. I'll link the video of their interview into the show notes, and you can watch these guys and go, there's nothing to it. But you're right. Nowadays, yeah, there's nothing to it at all. But back then, it just caused a huge uproar. Nobody swore on TV. The viewing public at that time, they were the people that were entrenched in this fantasy of the monarchy and tradition. They were wholly ignorant to the plight of the poor and discarded youth who were basically right in front of them on display in their living room. Like it or not, they couldn't escape it. So needless to say, with this F-bomb episode, all of the newspapers in the UK spend days replaying this incident as front page news. I mean, the Pistols, like Sinead, were now public enemy number one. They were filth. And funny enough, Bill Grundy actually also got suspended as a part of this stunt, even though he unwillingly took part in it. His career was done. Chalk one up for the anarchists. Now, while their exposure was now occupying the mainstream media, the Pistols had kind of forced their way into everybody's home. They were an unknown band, but now they were on the tip of everybody's tongue. The youth who had never heard of them before, because of this TV event, they started to understand who the Pistols were. The fan base of the Pistols started to grow. And in little time, the band was fully on its way to reaching the vision that Malcolm had only a year or two before. But the public wasn't quite ready for what was coming next. You see, no record label could work with them. EMI dropped them. They didn't want any part of the bullshit that, the fallout that came from those F-bombs on TV. Nowadays, if somebody did something outrageous like that, it would be all over social media and it would garner attention. It would lead to digital downloads. But back in the day, this isn't what happened. EMI said, screw that, we're done with these guys. They had to move on. They went on to yet another record label who, the same day that they signed them, these guys trashed a couple of rooms and the band was then ejected from that label. Virgin Records stepped up same day and said, screw that, we're going to sign these guys. Now, Virgin was a little bit more savvy. Richard Branson was a young guy. He saw what these guys were doing and he was on board with it. He wanted to shake up the establishment with them. The band had already recorded a song called God Save the Queen. And it was a good thing because God Save the Queen was released a week before the Queen's Jubilee. And it was a huge hit. Probably because of the band's TV appearance and all that negative media. Kids went out and they bought 150,000 physical copies in 12 days. It was an enormous feat for this unknown band to sell 150,000 copies in 12 days. Now, to celebrate, Virgin was like, let's keep them in the media, let's just jump all over this Queen's Jubilee, and let's really keep rolling with this. So what did they decide to do? Let's get this band on a boat on the Thames River, and let's follow the same path that the Queen's Jubilee River procession would take only 2 days later. From a publicity standpoint, to have this anti-monarch band play a song deriding the Queen on a boat in front of government offices, it was pure genius. It was a clear message to the youth. They rallied against tradition. That same tradition that led them to no future, no hope, no opportunities. The Pistols were going to make a grand statement that things were not all right. They were going to strip away that phony facade and uncover the stench and show the wound that society had become. See, as great as it was to plan this boat trip and to have the band play and be this riotous act, the police didn't quite agree with it. They didn't like the idea of some anachronistic bunch of Queen haters, float around in the middle of the Thames. So what did they do? They waited for the band and the boat to come ashore, and they basically raided them. Luckily, though, Malcolm knew that this was going to happen, so he had the band actually escape through a side stairwell. Malcolm and Vivian got arrested, but the band got away pretty much well unscathed. Again, there's a whole video of this whole event. It's poorly shot. It's the 70s. There wasn't much for mobile videography at the time, but I'm going to link it on the show notes. It's worth a watch. So now what was the result of the stunt? So when the UK official music chart for Jubilee Week was released, God Save the Queen was number 2. Fell just behind Rod Stewart. And that is interesting because of this. 2 reasons. 1, Sex Pistols never got airplay on the radio. They were banned from all stations. The other side of it was this. People in the music industry, they knew that Rod Stewart wasn't number 1 that week. It was complete bullshit. The traditional media industry, they used their leverage to hold the Pistols down to number 2. Now, you might want to call that a victory for the old guard, but it was a short-term victory. Because God Save the Queen, it went on to be called one of Rolling Stone's 500 most influential songs of all time. In my eyes, chalk another one up for the anarchists. So, there we have it. one musician who made a huge impact, but who lost the message, and her career suffered despite being extremely talented and, in the end, a beacon for the abused. And then on the flip side, we have a musical act who had a clear message full of anti-establishment tendencies, and they never wavered. They never had their message misinterpreted. They amplified that message with each and every stunt, and it led them to become legends. So what can we learn? Well, as artists or anybody in the creative field, publicity stunts are probably going to be in your future if you're really serious about getting attention. I mean, in the current world of seriously short attention span, you really have to get out there publicly, to make a dent in all this noise. But that doesn't mean you can just hack together some bullshit ploy. One thing about social media nowadays, it's very savvy. And the last thing you want to do is get on social media with some half-cocked idea, because you'll get buried. So, what are you supposed to do? Well, here's some tips for you to consider before you go and make an ass of yourself. And these come from a guy named James Herring. He's a PR specialist, but I found his stuff online, and his tips kind of fall in with what I was talking about earlier in the episode. So we all know what the golden rule is. The first rule, and it's the end-all be-all. Stunts need to be entertaining, yes, and they need to be engaging, but they also must be rooted in a coherent narrative that integrates with the rest of the marketing message. So like I'm saying, you need a clear message. Tip number 2. Now, most stunts necessitate a picture or video, and if that's the case, you need to resist the temptation to brand the crap out of it, all right? No logos, no nothing, no messaging. Point number 3. Sometimes it's easier to join a conversation than it is to start one. There are endless opportunities to ride the topical news agenda of the day and to integrate your brand into that stream. Now, I understand where he's coming from here. There's lots of causes that are on our social media streams every day, and, maybe it's good to jump in on some of them that you truly believe in and want to align yourself with. The problem is this. When you do that, you just become one voice in a room full of voices. So I would say to you as an artist, sure, pick causes you agree with, and they may be popular causes, but take a unique voice on them. Take a leadership role on some of these. Stand out above the crowd. Don't just become another person and another hashtag. Number 4, people love audacity, originality, bravery, and of course they love to be entertained. So the best stunt marketing is both audacious and bold. The greater the risk, the greater the return. But never lose sight of rule number 1, right? Sinead, what she did was brave. It was original. It was audacious, but she lost sight of the message. Number 5, with the right idea, a brand can also engage with an audience on a far more meaningful level, building on social, experimental, and interactive elements. I mean, this just screams to us creative types. Come at people with a new way of messaging. Think about what your message is, your clear message, and then think of a very unique way to broadcast that. That's an interesting thing, and as artists, you guys should be all over this. Number 6, this is extremely important. Interrogate the idea thoroughly. Always ask the difficult questions like, what could go wrong? Think of Sinead, think of Janet. All right, those things went sideways fast. Really pull your idea apart to see if this does go sideways. What's the worst that can happen? Number 7, remember that you're not trying to hoodwink the media. They don't like being part of the ploy, okay? They don't like having to be tricked or lied to. If you're delivering something meaningful and smart and entertaining, that's all it needs to be. You don't need to lie to people. You don't need to be clickbait. And here's the final one, number 8. Let's just leave these stunts to the professionals. If you're going to do a publicity stunt, go hire somebody who's done these things before with success. Don't just 100% entrust them to making over who you are and projecting that out to the public. I mean, that's dangerous because everybody can make mistakes. They can misinterpret who you are or try to put a spin on you that you're not ready for. So make sure that you're going to work with somebody who understands you and your message, but let them come up with the grand scheme. Because there's things that you have no idea about as an artist that they may have a better idea on. So do your homework, find somebody you want to work with, and work with them. It may cost you a little bit of money. You don't have to engage these kinds of PR firms, but it's usually in your best interest if you do. Okay, so that's it for this episode. As always, I hoped I provided some food for thought. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe or leave a comment, a rating if you haven't done so already. This allows me to get more visibility and hopefully to have more artists listening to the podcast. Now, stop listening to me and go dominate the media. Thanks.